One of the things that we do at a lot of client engagements is vendor bake-off or vendor selection for a specific product. And it's always a balance between putting enough energy into making sure you've got the right product to, picking one and moving on. So you could move quickly through, have that bias for action, have that quick engagement, but picking the right product can be important. So where do you think you start with that? What are the pieces you have to get in place to get a selection right? Or when have you seen them go wrong?
I'd start with requirements.
Oh, you and your requirements.
Well, I think me and Lysander are both on that end. But yeah, I'd want to understand the requirements involved so we know the criteria, by which we're basing the selection on. So, again, what problem we're trying to solve, and then, what requirements we need to meet in support of, providing that solution.
Do you do that? Because when I've seen it come and work well, it's like a scorecard. You have all the requirements to it, and even measuring them out of like must-haves. Sure, would be nice to have these, and bonus features.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you can have weighted requirements, the things you have to have as you spelled out. Having that, if they roll up into a scorecard, that's even better. But you may have sometimes tens, hundreds requirements, and that could be difficult. So at some point, you got to either aggregate or pick
for the actual scoring. But I mean,
sure.
I see too many selections made without a good analytic way to look at the data. It's like, I really like this one. I like the way the interface worked. Or I really like this one because the sales guy was nice.
Right. I like the logo.
Really not requirements.
Right.
No, but you have to put a scoring model in place that allows you to go through, because if you're evaluating something and there's 100 options, the scoring model hopefully allows you to filter out most of those and get down to what the real contenders are.
What about when you have a solution? So we just went through an HL7 tool, a mapping tool, and no two tools were created the same. It wasn't like you were choosing between, WordPerfect and Word. It was tools that operated different spectrums. So how do you judge from, well, I know the tool's great in section B, but I'm going to have to handwrite section A. I'm going to buy a third tool or a second tool to do section 3. How do you mesh those together?
I mean, that's where your requirements, I think, become critical, right? So, to Rob's point, not all requirements are created equal. Some are going to be more important than others, and you have to evaluate consistently through that lens. And then hopefully, again, that gets you to a place where you're at a smaller list. And then at that point, it's just documenting the differences, right? And then the team has to evaluate, okay, tool A does this well, tool B does these other things differently but equally. So what's more important to us over the long run?
Because it's tough when you have a requirement like, must do single sign-on. And tool A has a built-in thing. You can go plug it into AD, all's well. The other tool, you can make it work because it has a simple username and password. And you can build a little wrapper around it. And you can do that pretty easily. Mm-hmm. How do you you're meeting the requirements, but very different approaches?
I think it goes back to, the how you weight them or how you score them for each of those requirements. I'm going to be looking at the better. So for that security solution, if I can get either, one with MFA or single sign-on or, versus having to always enter an ID and password, that's probably what I would score higher, that solution higher than the other. I'd also look, ask how do we actually get a starting list of the different vendors to even, look at or, consider when we're talking about it. We have a scorecard, which I think should be thought of, in advance early on. So we have something to vet these vendors as we're talking through them with them. Because we can use those to base some of the initial questions and the interview process, the assessment, and then, the point at which we bring a handful of vendors in, whatever the number is that makes sense, and kick them around a little bit more, get deeper into the details, we can start scoring accordingly and even, enhance the scorecard as well.
I've seen like a 2-phased approach work too, where you almost, you go out and you Google for 20 vendors, and then you whack off some because of price, you whack some because of, key missing features to get down to the set that you want to do the bake-off with. What are some good requirements to filter that list down, or some good ways to approach filtering that list down?
I know one of the things that I did historically was I guess this is where one of those, Gartner Magic Quadrants come into play. Because to me, I would tend to use something like that, in addition to Google, right? And figure out what it thinks is the best of breed, the upper right quadrant, and the like. Not base a decision on that, but give me the players in the space if I'm unaware of who they might be, or maybe I just know the one or two of them. But I would start with something like a Gartner or a Forrester and understand who they think are the heavy hitters. I would Google, and then I would start aligning them to their requirements that I know, and then bring them back into the group for broader discussion.
The other filter I've used is really what fits with your ecosystem. If you're a Microsoft shop and it's an Oracle-based product, or vice versa, or it's totally misalignment to your team skill, because operating these platforms could also be a big lift, and you don't want to do something totally new along with a new tool to that.
Sure. Yeah, and I would say once you understand the different logos that are out there and bringing them in, it's a great point to start vetting it based on what does fit, not necessarily eliminating them because it's Java based or you're a Microsoft shop or vice versa, but the idea of one may fit a little bit better because of in-house skill sets and such. But I would caution on eliminating something too quickly without judging it fully.
I mean, I think the other thing you want to look at is how old or how long has the problem existed, right? Because there may be tools in the marketplace that have been around for 20 years and are established, and then you've got newcomers. And those newcomers, they may or may not meet the need, but probably should be scrutinized closer just to make sure that they're, that the products are real. Because, I've seen some where the marketing presentation looks awesome, and it's like, oh my gosh, this tool does everything. But then when your team sit down to actually work with the product, oh, this is not quite as easy as the marketing folks said, or to implement and adopt it, you've got to do all these other things and jump through all these other hoops, where the more established vendors don't necessarily have the perfect tool, but it just works, and it works better than the newer, fancier thing. And the only way you're going to know that is by working with it closer, and not necessarily trusting the demos that you'll get from a salesperson or a marketing person.
I would definitely never trust the demos until you really get it in your own environment and try it. But the flip side to that, I would say a lot of times the newer products tend to be more agile, have more modern, maybe cloud native, more modern things built into them, and to have the flexibility that a 20-year-old tool may not have. It's hard to rule either one out because of that, because sometimes that 20-year-old is just it runs forever.
I'd also like to think that the older tool, or the one that's been around longer, has evolved over that time as well. It's not just what it used to be. I agree. I'd like to look for a solution that's more modern. Certainly a cloud-based solution, or somewhere a SaaS.
If you're in the
solution.
cloud, I mean, that's one of your requirements. If you're still on-prem,
well, do I have to host it? I don't care if it doesn't have to be hosted on-prem and somebody else is going to host it, or they manage the environment for me, then I'm probably going to lean more that way than me.
I certainly would, based on the client. I mean, a client that's got a cloud presence or moving towards the cloud, that certainly makes sense. If you're on-prem or you're whatever, that should be one of your requirements. Does it fit? Does it not fit?
Yeah, okay. How many vendors would you say is reasonable to bring in and actually start vetting against each other?
I think when you really do I would start with a big list, whether you go to Gartner or whatever. Yeah. Price, features, like total, get it down to 10. And then I try to get to 3 to 4 that I'm going to stand up as a POC, that I'm going to try within my environment, assuming they're big capital investments. If they're quick and easy, I might do 1 or 2 just to be done, because they're not going to be. But if they're big, substantial products, come in 3 or 4, build them out, try them out, have the team take them apart.
How long does that process usually last?
Depends on the tools. I mean, the HL7 went on for 3 months, 4 months.
I think it depends on the size of the problem, right? I mean, the larger the problem, the more complex the problem is, and what degree of certainty do you want to have once you've made the choice? Because that's the other thing you want to do, right, is be premature with your tool selection, and then realize 6 months into the project that this is missing some key capability. And then at that point, what do? Are you going to try to cobble something custom on top of it to make up for the difference, or are you going to go back and look at other
I think
options?
some of that is what's the cost of failure? The cost of implementing SAP and failing bad, the cost of implementing spell checker is probably not as high. Something that you can do quick and easy. If it's bad in 6 months, spend another $2,000 and get a different one, rather than spending 6 months trying to pick that.
Sure. I would still think going into it, you'd want to time box it in some fashion because you can't
Yes.
let that thing run on for months
Especially
and
with
months.
developers. If you've got 3 that you're going to look, you get 3 months, 3 weeks to each one. In 9 weeks we need an answer.
I also think you have to compare them the same way, right? And you can't have one set of rules for one and different rules for each one and expect to be able to evaluate them.
Well, I've seen that happen a lot where you evaluate tool 1, you don't actually know much about the tool space. 2, you get a little better. By the time you get to the third one, you know so much about the product, HL7 or whatever. You're like, this tool's great. I know how to do everything. You never gave tool 1 a fair shake.
Do you go back and look at it at that point?
If you're mature enough, I think you have to. At least go back and, turn it back on, take another crack at it, make sure that you didn't give it a bad rap because it was your lack of education rather than the tools.
Then what about the people side of the bake-off? I mean, who do you have on the team doing the work?
Well, it's just like in good Agile or Scrum teams, you need somebody from each discipline. You can't just have the developers look at it because the installation may be ridiculous. You can't have the infrastructure guys look at it without the devs like actually lifting the hood and seeing how they would utilize it. And if you got database components, you need to have them involved too.
What about bias? I mean, you could have folks in any of those disciplines working, but if they've got bias towards a particular product, how do you make sure that doesn't?
I don't have a good answer for that one because you know what's going to happen. If you're a Microsoft shop, you're going to pick Microsoft. If you've used a tool before, you're certainly more apt to pick that tool again, which may not be a bad thing because you should be able to get to prototype faster. So, the knowledge of your team is not something to discount.